My name is Celestine. I turned 71 last October, and I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning in March when my son Rafferty sat across from me at my own dining room table and said, "You always make everything about yourself, you know that?" He wasn't shouting. That might have been easier to absorb. He said it the way you'd point out that someone had left a cabinet door open, casually, almost boredly, as though it were a fact so well established it barely warranted the energy of real emotion. I had been telling him about a health scare I'd had the previous week, a brief thing, a vertigo episode that had sent me gripping the bathroom door frame at 2 in the morning, genuinely frightened in a way I hadn't been in years. I had thought he'd want to know. I had thought that was the kind of thing a son would want to know. Instead, he glanced at his phone while I was talking, and when I paused, that sentence came out of him like something he'd rehearsed without knowing it. I remember the light in the room, winter thin, coming in sideways through the curtains I'd made myself 20 years ago. I remember the smell of the coffee going cold between us. I remember thinking, very clearly and very quietly, I do not recognize the dynamic in this room. If you are past 60 and you have felt that eerie, disorienting moment of looking at your own child and not knowing quite who you are to them anymore, then you already understand something that is very hard to put into words. The relationship shifted when you weren't watching. You became something other than what you were, and nobody handed you a map for that. I didn't respond to Rafferty that morning. I picked up my cup, took a sip of the cold coffee, and said I needed to get ready for an errand. He left 20 minutes later. I stood at the window and watched his car back out of the driveway, and I thought, how did we get here? The honest answer took me months to fully accept. We got here gradually, over a decade or more, through a series of choices I made that I believed were generous and were actually something else entirely. After my husband Thornton died, I did what many women of my generation do in the absence of the life they had built. I reorganized my sense of purpose around my children. Not dramatically, not in ways anyone would have flagged as excessive. I started saying yes more automatically. I became available in a way that probably looked, from the outside, like devotion. Rafferty needed someone to drive his daughter Willa to her Saturday lessons because his wife Petra was working. I went. My daughter Isolde needed help addressing invitations for a charity event she was organizing. I sat at her kitchen table for an afternoon doing it. My youngest, Cormac, who lives 3 states away, called me every Sunday, and I made sure I was always home for those calls, even when it meant cutting short something else. I told myself this was what love looked like in practice. Showing up, being useful, staying woven into the fabric of their lives so that none of us had to feel the particular grief of growing apart. What I didn't understand, what took me an embarrassingly long time to see, is that I was teaching them something with every yes. I was teaching them the shape of me, and the shape I was teaching them was one that bent. Isolde stopped asking if I was free before she made plans that involved me. She would simply tell me what time to arrive. Rafferty began speaking to me in a tone I can only describe as managerial, efficient, slightly impatient, like someone addressing a capable but somewhat slow assistant. Cormac was kinder in manner, but had developed a habit of dismissing my concerns with cheerful reassurance that had the effect, however unintentional, of making me feel like a child being patted on the head. None of them meant to be unkind. I want to be very clear about that, because what I've learned is that this dynamic rarely comes from malice. It comes from momentum. You establish a pattern, and then the pattern runs itself. The Tuesday morning with Rafferty was not the first time something had stung, but it was the first time I sat with the sting long enough to ask myself an honest question. What is my part in this? I want to tell you about my neighbor Prudence, because she is part of how things changed for me. Prudence is in her late 50s, teaches secondary school, and has the particular quality of seeing situations with great clarity without being unkind about what she sees. We had been friendly for years in the way of people who share a fence and occasionally share a glass of something cold in summer. But we had never been truly close. A few weeks after the morning with Rafferty, I found myself telling her about it. We were both in our respective gardens, and I'm not entirely sure how it happened. One minute we were talking about the frost damage to her hedgerow, and the next I was describing the scene at my dining room table, and finding, to my own surprise, that my voice had gone slightly unsteady. Prudence listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think he'd speak to a colleague that way?" I said I didn't think so. "No," she agreed. "People don't speak to colleagues that way. They speak that way to people they've decided don't have the authority to object." That sentence stayed with me for a long time. I turned it over in the following days. I thought about all the situations in which I had implicitly confirmed that I would not object. Not because I had no objections, but because I had trained myself to swallow them in the name of keeping things smooth. I thought about the number of times I had prefaced a concern with an apology. The number of times I had softened a true feeling into something so gentle it carried no weight at all. The number of times someone had interrupted me, and I had simply stopped, folded up whatever I'd been saying, and put it away. I had been doing this so long, I had stopped noticing I was doing it. The first thing I changed was very small, and felt, in the moment, almost violent in its simplicity. Isolde called to tell me, not ask, tell, that she needed me to look after her dog Fenwick for a long weekend in April, while she and her husband took a trip they had apparently already booked. I like Fenwick. That isn't the point. The point is the assumption, delivered without a question mark anywhere in the sentence. I said, "I have plans that weekend. I'm not going to be able to." There was a pause. In that pause, I could feel Isolde recalibrating. She had not anticipated this particular response. "What plans?" she said. And here is where the old version of me would have faltered, would have offered something that could be argued with, would have made the plans sound provisional, small, easily reshuffled. But I had been thinking about what Prudence said, about authority and the people who decide you don't have it, and so I said simply, "Plans I've made. I'll help you think of someone else if that's useful." She was not pleased. She managed to be polite about not being pleased, which I appreciated, but the displeasure was there in the pauses. We ended the call without resolution, and I sat with the discomfort of having disappointed her, and found, to my genuine surprise, that I could bear it. It was uncomfortable, not unbearable. There is a meaningful difference. I did not call back to retract. I did not manufacture an excuse that sounded softer. I let the boundary stand where I'd placed it. Over the weeks that followed, I began to notice the places where I shrunk out of habit rather than preference. The reflexive deferral, the unnecessary qualification, the apology for occupying space that was legitimately mine to occupy. I started a practice that sounds simple, but cost me something each time. Before I agreed to anything, I paused long enough to ask myself a single question. Am I doing this because I want to, or because I am afraid of the discomfort that follows if I don't? If the answer was fear, I tried to say no. Not coldly, not with a production of explanation, just, no, I'm not able to do that. Or, I need to think about it, which is a complete sentence. The thinking about it was important. I had always rushed to answer immediately, as though my value was somehow measured in the speed of my availability. Taking 3 days before calling Isolde back about Fenwick, or 2 days before telling Rafferty that I wasn't comfortable with a particular arrangement. These pauses confused my children at first. They were not accustomed to me having an interior life that took time to consult. I also stopped explaining myself into the ground. This was harder than I expected. The pull to justify, to offer so much context for a no, that the no eventually dissolved into nothing. That pull was strong, and it was old. I had to consciously resist it every time. I would say what I had decided, and then I would stop talking. The silence that followed felt enormous. I let it be enormous. I let them fill it however they needed to. Around this time, I began spending my Tuesday mornings differently. I had always spent them doing laundry or running errands, tasks that accumulated because everyone else's schedules had implicitly claimed the better hours. I started going instead to a small reading group that met at the library 3 blocks from my house. I had walked past the sign for years. I walked through the door for the first time on a rainy Tuesday in April and sat down at a table with 5 other people and spent 2 hours talking about a novel, and something in me that had been very quiet for a very long time made a sound. These people did not know me as Rafferty's mother, or Thornton's widow, or anyone's convenience. They knew me as Celestine, who had interesting things to say about the book, who laughed at the right moments, who was worth listening to. It was such a modest thing to rediscover. I don't know why it moved me as much as it did. I also started painting again. I had painted in my 30s and stopped for no good reason. The way you stop things that are entirely for you, when life fills with things that are for everyone else. I bought a small set of watercolors, and I painted badly and happily at my kitchen table on weekend mornings, and I refused to apologize to anyone for the enjoyment I took from it. I let myself eat when I was hungry rather than when it was convenient for visitors. I let myself turn off my phone in the evenings. I let myself say, "I'm busy," without attaching an inventory of evidence. None of these are dramatic gestures. I want to be honest about that. None of them changed my life in the way of sudden revelations. but they accumulated. And what they accumulated into was a person who felt, quietly and increasingly, like herself. Cormac was the first of my children to say something that indicated he'd noticed a change. He called on a Sunday. I was there. I'd just stopped rearranging my whole afternoon around the possibility. And partway through the conversation, he said, "You sound different lately, Mom. Lighter, maybe." I didn't make a large moment of it. I said I was doing well and asked about his work. But I noticed. Rafferty came by one afternoon unannounced, which he had always done on the assumption that I would always be there, with nothing more urgent than waiting. I was on my way out to meet Prudence for a walk. He stood on my front step looking mildly nonplussed. "I just thought I'd stop in," he said. "I'm heading out," I told him. "I'll be back around 4 if you want to come back or call." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read. Then he nodded and said, "Okay, yeah, I'll call you." He did call later that week. Not to ask for anything, just to talk. We had a longer conversation than we'd had in months, and at the end of it he said, quietly, "I'm sorry if I've been dismissive sometimes, Mom. I think I've been stressed, and I've been taking it out in ways I shouldn't." I want to be careful here about how I describe what followed, because it would be easy to present that moment as the resolution, as the scene where everything is repaired and the lesson is delivered, and we all understand each other perfectly now. That's not what happened. What happened is that I said, "I appreciate you saying that," and meant it, and we moved on. The relationship didn't transform overnight. It shifted, incrementally, the way most real things shift. Isolde and I had coffee together a month after the Fenwick conversation. She didn't apologize for the assumption she'd made, but she asked me, over her cup, what I'd been doing with my Tuesdays. I told her about the reading group. She seemed genuinely interested in a way that surprised me. She asked what book they were on. I told her. She said she'd always wanted to read it. It was a small door. We walked through it together, and neither of us mentioned what had been on either side of it. I think about a woman I knew growing up, my great-aunt Silvana, who was the most agreeable person I have ever encountered. She said yes to everything anyone asked of her. She smoothed every rough surface before anyone else had a chance to feel it. She was beloved, genuinely beloved, and I have almost no memory of anyone asking her what she thought about anything. Not because they didn't love her, because she had arranged herself so thoroughly around their comfort that her own interiority had become nearly invisible. I loved Silvana, and I cannot remember a single conversation with her in which I felt I was talking to someone who had an actual stake in the outcome. I think that is the thing I most wanted to undo. Not the love my children have for me, I have never doubted that, but the invisibility. The arrangement that had placed me in the category of people whose feelings are managed rather than consulted. You cannot undo that arrangement by explaining it to the people who have benefited from it. You can only undo it by behaving differently and then letting them adjust. Some of them will. Some of them need more time. Some of them are working through their own accumulated losses and confusions, and cannot right now see you with the clarity you deserve. Not because you failed, but because they are human and limited, and doing their best with what they have. That is a hard grace to extend. I am still learning to extend it without losing myself in the extending. There is something I have come to believe, standing on this side of the shifts I have just described. Respect does not travel toward the person who pursues it. It moves toward the person who has already established it within themselves and is simply living from that place. I spent years trying to earn something that was not, in the end, earnable, not in the way I was going about it. Every yes I offered, hoping for recognition, taught the people I loved that my attention and time and energy were inexhaustible and interchangeable with their convenience. Every apology I gave for taking up space confirmed that taking up space was something I needed permission for. The day I stopped operating from that premise, the day I started moving through my life as someone whose presence has inherent weight, regardless of whether it is acknowledged, was not the day my children suddenly became different people. But it was the day I stopped waiting for them to make me feel like one. That is the thing nobody tells you when the roles begin to shift and the dynamic grows strange, and the child who once looked at you with unambiguous need now speaks to you with the distracted patience of someone managing a situation. Nobody tells you that the most powerful thing you can do is not argue, not withdraw, not pursue, but simply become, again and more fully, the person you actually are. At 71, I am painting badly on weekend mornings and reading books I find genuinely interesting and saying no with a cleanness that no longer feels cruel. I am disagreeing when I disagree and offering my opinion when I have one, and letting the silence sit after I've spoken, instead of rushing to soften what I said. My children are adjusting. Rafferty calls more often than he did a year ago. Isolde and I are reading the same book. Cormac, on the phone last Sunday, said, "I want to hear what you actually think, Mom, not the diplomatic version." I almost laughed out loud. I told him the diplomatic version had been retired. He seemed pleased. It is not a perfect resolution. Families are not stories with clean endings. They are ongoing negotiations between people who love each other imperfectly and are all, simultaneously, trying to figure out who they are. What I can tell you is that the negotiation feels different now. I feel different in it, more present, more solid, less afraid of the cost of my own honesty. If you are where I was, if you are standing in your kitchen after someone you raised has spoken to you as though your thoughts are clutter, as though your age has made you peripheral, as though you owe your availability to anyone who needs it, I want you to hear this. The thing you are feeling is real, and it is pointing you toward something. Not toward anger, not toward withdrawal, toward yourself. You were someone before you were their parent. You are still that person. The opinions you hold have weight. The life you are living has value that does not diminish with their distraction. You do not need to earn your way back into your own worth. You only need to live from it. Start small. Let one yes become a no. Let one apology go unspoken. Let one boundary stand where you placed it without rushing back to soften the edges. See what happens when you stop flinching. What I found, on the other side of all of that, was not a resolved family or a fixed dynamic, or children who had transformed into the idealized versions of themselves. What I found was Celestine, still here, still curious, still worth talking to. Still, after all of it, enough. That turned out to be everything I needed to find.